In this section, we discuss global illumination or GI or indirect lighting. We'll learn about the basic concepts, we'll learn about different GI engines and which one to use in different lighting situations. In this video, I'll be explaining some of the fundamental concepts regarding global illumination or indirect lighting. Global illumination is a series of algorithms to make lighting in 3D renders more realistic and look closer to how light rays work in real world. Without global illumination enabled in the settings, we would only get direct lighting, the light that directly comes from a light source. But when GI is enabled, those light rays won't be killed off when they hit the first surface point on their way from the light source. Like real world, those light rays start to bounce back and forth from those surfaces, and as those light rays hit a surface, they arrive with illumination and color information from the last surface point that they hit. But with each bounce, they lose some of that energy until we instruct the light rays to stop bouncing. Keep what I just explained in mind. Let's go to the scene and let's see what we have. As you can see, it's a fairly simple scene and it's going to help us to go through the very basics of global illumination concepts very easily. Now, you notice I have a redshift area light on the ceiling and that is our only light source in the scene. I have two cameras in the scene and for the second one, I have near clipping enabled so we can see inside the room. If I open up Redshift's render view, I have already saved some renders from this scene. In the first two renders, global illumination or GI is disabled, so we are only dealing with direct lighting. And in the last two renders, GI is enabled, so we have both direct and indirect lighting. I'm gonna just open up the render with GI off from our first camera. Now let's see how light rays function in real world. So first, the light rays are cast from the light source into the scene. Those light rays travel until they hit a surface, and based on how bright the light source is and how far is the surface from the light source, the surface gets illuminated. When a specific light ray hits a surface, obviously it can't continue its path and we get shadows. Right now, the shadows are very dark. That is because GI or indirect lighting is turned off and we won't allow our light rays to bounce back and forth between surfaces and they get killed off as soon as they hit the first surface on their way from the light. But as I mentioned earlier, light rays aren't killed off when they first hit a surface. They are going to bounce back and forth between surfaces and transform illumination and color information between them. When we enable GI, we allow the light rays to have this realistic behavior. Now, if I open up the render with GI on from the first camera, now we can see the shadows are a lot brighter. So let's draw some light rays here and see how this realistic behavior is happening. We focus on this desk and chair here, and you can imagine the same behavior for the rest of the scene. So the light rays are cast from the light source in different directions. Obviously, some rays hit the top of the desk and top of the chair, illuminate those surfaces, and cast shadows beneath them. Now let's imagine a light ray hits the floor near the chair and the desk. Now, as we know, this ray is going to continue to bounce, and let's say in its first bounce, it hits under the chair and illuminate that surface a bit. It bounces from that surface again, and based on its vector and trajectory, it's probably going to hit the areas with the dark shadows beneath the chair and therefore making the shadows a bit brighter. Obviously, with each bounce, the ray loses some of its energy. One of the other fascinating things about GI is what we call color bleeding. As I mentioned, those light rays carrying both illumination information and color information. Now let's clear out these drawings and let's say a light ray is cast from the light source and hits this red wall. We have GI on, so we expect the light to bounce and hit another surface. Now, based on the surface properties, this light ray might scatter into several rays and each one would continue to bounce in the scene. Let's say one of these rays bounces back and hit the ceiling near the wall. This ray now has some color information and has picked some red color from the wall. And when it hits the next surface, that surface is going to be a bit redder compared to before arriving this ray. If I hover over and take a look at the pixel information on the right side, we can clearly see the red value here is way more compared to the green and blue values. You might ask, if this ray is having red information, why it's not turning the surface into a pure or a bit more obvious red color? Because first of all, this light ray is losing energy at each bounce, and also the receiving surface has some surface properties. In this case, it's a white diffuse surface that might block some of that information. Here in this render, we can see all the surfaces close to the red wall or facing it are redder and the ones close to the green wall or facing it are greener. In this example, we use some lonely rays to explain how light functions, but in fact, for each scene, we are dealing with millions of rays, and that's why the renders are often take some time. Now let's open up the render settings window in Redshift to enable global illumination. While in the basic mode, you can check this global illumination checkbox, but in the advanced mode, we have the global illumination tab and you can check enable GI using this enable checkbox to get Redshift to calculate GI or indirect lighting for you. The first thing you'll notice is we have primary and secondary engines. Primary engine is calculating the first light bounce and secondary engine calculates subsequent bounces. And obviously you can use different methods like brute force, point cloud, and light cache to compute those light bounces. Now let's see how Redshift uses these primary and secondary engines. Let's go to our second camera with GI on render. Our main camera is about here in the scene. Now, in order to determine what's in the view, Redshift casts the first rays from the camera into the scene. When a ray hits a surface, to determine whether that point is in illumination or in shadow, a ray which is called a shadow ray, let's use a black color for this ray, will be cast towards the light source. If there is no object between that point and the light source, that point would be in direct illumination. But if there is an obstacle between that point and the light source, that point will be in shadow. Until now, we just determined the direct illumination, whether a point is in direct light or in shadow. Now it's time to calculate GI or indirect illumination. So let me just clear these drawings. The colors I'm using here are for pure presentation and have absolutely no specific meaning or role in the calculations. Now, these green rays are cast from the camera. And when they hit a point on a surface, a sample will be created. That is what we call a GI sample. And let's imagine these samples are red. Now from this point or sample, which we already have its direct lighting information, whether it's in direct light or shadow, the first primary GI engine comes to play and sends out a hemispherical burst of rays into the scene to gather information from the scene. So if a ray hits the green wall based on the distance between the sample and the wall, that point will get some of that green color from the wall. And if another ray, let's say, hits the red color on the other wall, and let's say that red wall is closer to the sample point compared to the green wall, now that sample point will gather more red compared to green. So that's what the primary engine does. But we said that in real world, the rays are not going to be stopped when they first hit a surface. From the second bounce, the secondary GI engine comes to play, and from each primary ray casts or bounces another ray, and that ray, which let's say is blue, will continue to bounce in the scene and transform information between points in the scene. The secondary engine will continue to bounce the rays in the scene and will stop based on the settings in the global illumination tab. So we can tell the secondary GI engines to bounce each ray for, let's say, 4 times or 3 times in the scene. Obviously, the more we let the rays to bounce, the scene gets brighter and the final render would be more realistic. But as with each bounce, the rays lose some energy. After a while, they don't have any worthy contribution to the final lighting. So we can kill them off, and by doing so, our render times will be more manageable. Also, we can control the first burst of rays, which is controlled by the primary engine. We can determine how many rays it will cast into the scene from each sample. We can do that in the settings window, and more rays will result in a cleaner GI solution. We will discuss all of that and specific settings for different GI engines in the rest of this section. So that was an introduction to how light functions and what is direct and indirect lighting, what is GI, and how it works in Redshift. See you in the next lesson to learn more about different GI engines and other topics related to indirect lighting. In this lesson, we talk about brute force GI engine. Let's open up the render settings, change the mode to advanced, and go to the global illumination tab. Brute force is the most basic GI engine. It's straightforward, very easy to set up, and gives you the best GI solution out there. But it's a bit slower compared to Point Cloud or Iridian's Cache. As the primary engine, you either use brute force or Iridian's Cache. Point Cloud is often used as a secondary GI engine as it does not pick up details at all. To be very honest with you, I haven't used Iridian's Cache in a few years, and brute force is my favorite primary GI engine. And you realize why as we go through this chapter. And as the secondary GI engine, you can use either Point Cloud or brute force. The reason brute force is slower is because it's more accurate. In brute force, every shaded point has its GI computed separately and independently from other points. So even though it's slow, but because brute force calculates GI for each point separately, it can give you the most accurate GI solution. So let's jump in and see how it works. For the first part of this lesson, I'll be using the same scene we had for our previous lesson. Now let's see how brute force works in general. For that, let me undock and maximize the render view and actually load the side camera view here. Our camera is roughly here in the scene. Brute force is a view-dependent GI method, so everything should start from the camera to determine what is in the view and what's not. So the first rays, let's say they are green, are cast from the camera. Now, because in this case brute force is handling our global illumination, every single shaded point, which means every pixel in the view, would get one of these rays. So if you imagine a 1000 by 1000 pixel render, we will have roughly about 1 million initial rays cast from the camera. At each point, we'll have a GI sample, obviously. Let's say they are red. So every single shaded point will get one of these samples when brute force is used as the primary GI method. Now from each sample, the first primary rays in a hemispherical fashion will be cast into the scene. and start gathering information from the scene. We call this the first bounce. Just remember this and keep it in your mind. So the primary rays are cast from each GI sample to gather information about the scene. Now, based on that information, the indirect lighting or GI for each point will be calculated. So that's what brute force does if chosen as a primary engine. Now, if brute force selected as the secondary GI engine, from each point on the surface that was hit by a primary ray, a single ray will be traced and starts to bounce back and forth in the scene. The number of these bounces depends on this bounces parameter in the global illumination settings. So the first red rays were the first bounce, and each subsequent blue ray or arrow is another bounce. Let's see how we can use brute force as our GI solution for this scene. We already changed our primary GI engine to brute force. We can change our secondary GI engine to brute force as well. Now, if we set the number of bounces to 1, the secondary GI engine will be disabled. Don't forget, the first bounce is being controlled by the primary GI engine, those red rays. And from the second bounce, the secondary GI engine takes control. And as we decided to only have one GI bounce for now, we don't need the secondary GI engine. To analyze the render a bit better, open up the AOV manager. Let's add our global illumination and our diffuse lighting AOVs. Diffuse lighting is the direct lighting pass and global illumination is the indirect lighting pass or AOV. Now, without changing anything, let's start the render. I won't be using IPR for now and go for final render to see the final result. Now, as you can see, we start rendering the final image immediately when brute force is set as our GI engine. When we cover other GI engines, you realize they actually go through some pre-passes to calculate GI before rendering the final image. So that is another good thing about brute force. This render took about 7 seconds. If you compare it to the render from the previous lesson, you can see it's a bit darker, and that's because right now we are only using our primary GI engine and there are no secondary bounces to light up the scene even more. If we check out the global illumination pass, you can see it's a bit noisy, and the noise shows up a bit in the final RGB pass as well. Now, the reason the global illumination noise does not show up in the final RGB pass in this particular render, it's because we have an easy lighting. The direct light from above reaches a lot of surfaces in the scene. But if we had a more difficult scene and we had to rely heavily on global illumination, and by difficult scene I mean a scene where the direct light does not reach most of the surfaces, this noise would show up in the final render much more obviously, and we had to deal with the noise. Now, how can we improve this and make it cleaner? If we go back to the GI tab under the brute force section, we only get this parameter called rays, which in theory should control the quality of the brute force GI engine, meaning higher values should give you cleaner and less noisy brute force GI solution. But the way Redshift is set up by default, changing this value would not affect the quality of your brute force GI solution, because if you check the sampling tab, automatic sampling is enabled, which simply means Redshift handles the balance between all the noise in the scene from different sources like direct and indirect lighting, rough reflections and refractions and so on, and it only gives you one parameter to control that noise level, which is this noise threshold value. This threshold value is the same as the bucket quality option in the basic mode. You notice here as we go from low to very high, we just decrease this threshold value to get a cleaner render. Let's get back to the advanced mode. So by default, like any other noise, if you want to get a cleaner brute force solution, you can simply use a lower threshold value under the sampling tab. So again, by default, there is no parameter here to control the quality of the brute force method separately when it is set as the primary or secondary GI engine. And that is actually a very good thing. Unlike other GI engines that have tons of confusing options to control how they operate, brute force works out of the box and you just need to handle those high frequency noise visible in your render when using brute force. And that is done with the noise threshold value as I mentioned. So this noise threshold parameter handles noise universally. So if you are looking for a cleaner brute force GI solution, simply reduce this noise threshold value, which reduces other noises as well. We talk about sampling in detail in the rendering section of the course. Let's decrease it for now from 0.01 to 0.005. Take a snapshot from our previous render. And if we render the scene right now, let's take a snapshot from this render as well and compare it with our previous render. We get a noticeably cleaner render even though the render time has almost doubled from 7 seconds to 12 seconds. We can obviously set our previous render as the A side and our new render as the B side and compare the GI pass as well. And as you can see, it is much cleaner compared to our previous render. Remember, when using brute force, the goal is not to have a ridiculously smooth GI pass. That is just not something feasible, and you don't need that to achieve a noise-free render. You try to make it reasonably clean within a rational time frame, and you can rely on the noiser to get you past the line if needs be. But you see, even at a noise threshold of 0.005, we have a very clean GI solution. Let's try even a lower noise threshold value to get an almost perfect GI solution, maybe 0.002, and take a render. So the render took longer, about 18 seconds, but the result is very smooth and we get a very clean render. We can compare it to our two previous renders and watch the progress, especially when compared to the first render when noise threshold was 0.01. This render is much cleaner. For this scene, a noise threshold value of around 0.005 is probably enough. But for now, I'm gonna use 0.01 to get faster renders. So that's it. A single value can be used to control the quality of your brute force GI solution. The lower the noise threshold value, the cleaner your GI solution. That is why I love brute force. It's so simple and user-friendly. We will talk about this raise amount under the brute force settings briefly at the end of this lesson, which can be used to control the quality of your brute force solution separately from other noise sources. We'll learn about sampling and how global illumination sampling works with other sampling settings in the rendering section of the course. Let's move on for now. Obviously, we need to have a secondary GI solution to start bouncing our primary rays to get a more accurate GI solution. So let's for now use brute force as the secondary GI engine as well. And to do that, first we need to have more than one GI bounce. So let's set it to 2 for now. And now make sure your secondary engine is brute force as well and start another render. Now we get a more accurate GI solution with both the primary GI engine and the secondary GI engine, and that is apparent in the brighter shadows compared to when we only had primary GI engine enabled with one bounce. Now let's take a look at this bounces parameter here. Right now we only have 2 GI bounces. As I explained, the first is being controlled by the primary GI engine, and from the second bounce, secondary GI engine will take control. Less bounces will result in an overall darker indirect lighting. So when we went from 1 bounce to 2 bounces, we got a brighter and more accurate render. Let's try 3 bounces and render again. This render took about 2 seconds longer. If we take a snapshot again and compare it to our previous render when bounces was set to 1 and 2, the render is brighter. The GI solution is more accurate because we allow our GI rays to bounce more in this scene. And as that process needs more calculation, the render will be longer. Let's try 4 bounces and render the scene. So the render took longer by about 2 seconds again. And if we save it and compare it to our previous renders, we get brighter render and a more physically accurate GI solution. In most cases, you really don't need more than 4 GI bounces, as from a certain point you just get longer render times without any noticeable improvement to the GI solution, and you might start to get a washed out look. You remember the red and blue arrows we draw at the beginning of this lesson and in the previous one discussing primary and secondary GI engines and GI bounces. So the first bounce here is those red arrows from the hemispherical burst around each sample. The second bounce is the first blue arrow bouncing from the end of that red arrow. The third bounce is the second blue arrow that bounces from the end of the first blue arrow. Not quite technically accurate, but I hope this clarifies any possible lingering question that you might have from previous explanations. So setting brute force as both primary and secondary GI engines is the most hassle-free, easy way of dealing with GI in Redshift, which results in the most accurate renders. But to balance and manage your render times a bit, you can opt for point cloud as the secondary GI engine. And honestly, in some cases, especially like interior shots, you might have to use point cloud, as using brute force solution would be too long. Now, point cloud, or light cache as it's known in other render engines, is much faster compared to brute force, and especially for interior shots, and especially for more complex lighting scenarios. It doesn't have to be interior shots, meaning where we don't have a lot of incoming direct light. Point cloud can be a lifesaver. We talk about point cloud in the next lesson. For now, let's set the secondary GI engine to Iridian's point cloud and take another render. Now, it only took 6 seconds. The render time is essentially cut in half, which is amazing. And if I save and compare it to our previous render, which was done with brute force as both primary and secondary engine, first of all, the new render is cleaner a bit, as point cloud is faster compared to brute force. And if I'm being picky, the brute force render is a bit more accurate. We might have lost some of the contact shadows when using brute force point cloud instead. But unless you are being picky and you know what to look for, it won't be that visible. So as you can see, the combination of brute force and light cache or point cloud can be the perfect mix of accuracy and speed. But honestly, Redshift is so fast. For simpler scenes, you don't need to worry about render time at all. But for more complex scenes, the render time can be significantly reduced by using a brute force point cloud solution instead of a brute force solution for primary and secondary GI engines, as I'll be demonstrating it later on in this lesson. For the final render, let's change the secondary engine to brute force again, because it's a very simple scene and the direct light reaches most of the surfaces. Set the bounces to 4. In the sampling tab, let's reduce the threshold a bit to 0.004 and render the scene again. And here is our clean and extremely accurate final render, which took around 35 seconds to render. Now, as promised, let's quickly talk about this raise value. What is exactly this raise control here? Remember those red circle we used to represent individual GI sample, which from each a hemispherical burst of rays would be sent out to the scene to calculate GI for that sample. This rays value here controls the number of those red rays, because if you send more rays from each GI sample, they gather more information from the scene and the final GI calculation for that point will be more accurate. By default, Redshift uses the threshold value to decide how many rays will be necessary for that. But we can take that control away from Redshift and control that on our own. To do that, we need to go to the sampling tab and turn off automatic sampling. Now we need to personally control proper sampling amount for different things in the scene, like different lights, different shading effects, light reflection and refraction, our global illumination, and the rest. If I render the scene right now, we get a very noisy render. Our direct or diffuse lighting path is very noisy. Our GI path is very noisy, and we don't have anything like reflection or refraction to be worried about in this scene. Now we can get back to our GI tab, increase this raise number to, let's say, 512 instead, and render the scene again. Now we have a much cleaner GI path, but our direct lighting path is still very noisy. We have one light in the scene. Let's select it and increase its samples to, let's say, 256 and take another render. Now the diffuse or direct lighting path has cleaned up as well, and we get a fairly clean render. That should be enough for now. I don't want to go any further. We'll dig into sampling in due time later on in the course. For now, let's enable automatic sampling and set the raise value to its default of 16, as it won't affect the quality of our GI solution when automatic sampling is enabled. Now let's open up our second scene for this lesson. This is the scene we used for the interior lighting video in the previous section. Let's open up the render settings and go to the GI tab. You notice by default the primary engine is brute force and the secondary engine is point cloud, which is what we want in this case. Now this scene can teach us why using brute force as both primary and secondary solution is not always practical, because it can be very slow. In this scene we have a difficult lighting, meaning direct lighting can't reach to most of the surfaces. We rely heavily on indirect lighting, which is global illumination. If we just render the scene with the default GI engine, which are brute force and Iridian's point cloud, and render the scene, this will be our render, which took only 30 seconds. If I accidentally said light cache, it simply means point cloud, because they're the same thing, but the name differs here. Now, by the way, the threshold is set to 0.005 to get a cleaner render. But if we change the secondary engine to brute force to get a full brute force solution and render the scene, this will be our render, which took 3 minutes and 46 seconds. That is a 750% increase in render time, which is a bit too much, without offering any noticeable improvement in this case. If I change the secondary engine to point cloud, we get a very fast and clean render. So again, when you don't have a lot of direct light and you have to rely heavily on GI, like in most interior shots, using only brute force as both primary and secondary GI engine can result in very long render times compared to a brute force point cloud solution. So to sum it up, you can always rely on brute force to give you an accurate GI solution as your primary engine. For secondary engine, you can use either brute force or point cloud. For interior shots, using brute force as secondary engine will be a bit slow, but you can use brute force as your primary and secondary GI engine when you have a lot of direct light coming through. For more difficult shots, especially interior shots, point cloud as secondary GI engine is a faster choice. Overall, brute force is the most accurate solution. If you can handle longer render times, and this longer render time can be a few seconds if direct lighting can reach most of our scene, or can be much longer if direct lighting can't reach most of our scene. To wrap up this lesson, let's quickly summarize the pros and cons of brute force GI method. For its pros, we can say that it preserves all the details and contact shadows. There wouldn't be any artifacts or flickering in the animation if you use brute force as your GI solution. It doesn't require tons of memory, and as its cons, it can be a bit slow in certain scenes. Perfect. So that's about brute force. See you in the next video. In this video, we'll learn about Iridian's point cloud GI engine. First, we explore how it works and then take a look at its parameters, and after that, we'll be trying to utilize it in our scenes. Let's open up our render settings and go to the global illumination tab. You notice Iridian's point cloud is only available as a secondary GI engine. The reason being is that it's not quite good at picking up details, and that's why it is more suitable to be used as the secondary GI engine. It's on purpose so we can get our secondary bounces quick. So in most cases, you use brute force as your primary engine and Iridian's point cloud as your secondary GI engine. As we learned, you can use brute force as the secondary GI engine as well. Let's open up Redshift Render View and see how Iridian's point cloud works, which is a bit different compared to the overall way that brute force or Iridian's cache work. And load the render from our side view. Also, we can have our render settings window open as well. Our camera is roughly here. First, some rays are sent out from the camera into the scene. Whenever these rays hit a point on the surface, they create an Iridian's point cloud sample, and each ray will continue to bounce in the scene and create samples until the bounces value limit is reached. In this case, the bounces value is set to 4. One is for the primary engine and the other 3 is for the secondary engine. So each secondary GI engine ray can bounce 3 times, and whenever they hit, they create a sample. Each of these rays that come and bounce in the scene store all of that information in their path. And as we'll learn earlier in this section, these rays carry information between surfaces, and this is how point cloud can give us our global illumination solution. If you remember in previous videos, we talked about the primary and secondary GI engines and how primary GI engine is responsible for the first bounce and the secondary GI engine is responsible for the subsequent bounces. It doesn't have to happen sequentially. So if we are using brute force as our primary GI engine and point cloud as our secondary GI engine, it's not like the primary GI engine first sends out its hemispherical burst of red rays, then when they hit a point on a surface, the secondary engine takes over for the next bounces. In fact, what happens is that when we use point cloud as our secondary GI engine and start the render, first point cloud, like I showed you here, starts sending out its blue rays from the camera and bouncing them in the scene back and forth and create its samples. Then when the primary engine sends out its red rays from each of its samples to collect information from the scene and get a proper calculation for that sample, the point cloud samples and bounces are already there in the scene. So the red rays can simply use the information that is stored on those secondary GI samples and bounces. Those blue samples and arrows, I mean. Obviously, I'm using these colors to make it easier to understand, and there are no such things as blue or red rays. Now, it can be a bit confusing, but you really don't need to know all of these details. You just need to know how to utilize these engines in your projects. Let me change the layout to this RS01. When Light Cache is used as our secondary GI engine and you start a final render, you notice before the final render begins, Redshift first computes the Iridian's point cloud, which takes a few moments, then the final render starts. If I just attempt another render, you can see that in the render view status bar as well, it says Iridian's point cloud for a brief moment before the final render starts. Now, Iridian's point cloud has a few parameters compared to brute force. Let's take a look at them and see what they do. As point cloud is a secondary GI engine, it's hard to demonstrate these parameters with examples, and I don't think we need to do that here. I'm just going to give you a brief explanation and then move on to other things. This samples per pixel controls the number of rays that are cast from the camera per pixel. Obviously, the higher the number, the higher the quality of your samples, and therefore the higher the quality of your renders. For scenes that have a lot of direct lighting, you can use values like 8 or 16, and for scenes that have a difficult lighting, i.e. direct lighting can't reach most of the surfaces, you need to use values like 32 or even higher, 64. Next, we have the screen radius, which is by default is set to 16 pixels. I'll be using Redshift docs to explain this parameter as I couldn't explain it better myself. We know Iridium's point cloud stores samples around the scene. It can't store a point for each ray that was shot from the camera because doing so would generate an extremely large number of points for high-resolution images. Instead, it uses a screen space metric to space out these points, so the screen radius parameter refers to pixels. And this parameter affects two things. First, the used video card memory. Setting screen radius to larger values means that fewer points will be created and therefore less video card memory will be used. And also how often the results can be used by the primary GI engines. If the points are very far apart because of a large screen radius value, then the primary GI engine will not use those samples as often. So this can affect the performance of the primary GI engine. Therefore, lower screen radius values can translate into better rendering performance overall, or a better GI solution. Oftentimes, a setting of 8 or 16 will work fine. If your scene is of a high resolution, 2K or larger, you can try larger values such as 32 or 64. Another important parameter here is this retrace threshold. At the start of this lesson, I mentioned that Iridium's point cloud is not very good at picking up details. So the secondary GI samples created by the point cloud cannot be trusted in more detailed areas of the scene. So we are using the retrace threshold value to tell our primary GI engine to avoid using point cloud samples in corners and detailed areas to avoid artifacts, splotches, and light leaks. The larger the retrace threshold is, the more these points will not be used around corners and creases. Normally around 1 to 3 pixels would be enough in most cases. When rendering animation, you might need to use higher threshold values. Let me quickly show you how the threshold value can be useful. I'm gonna unhide this plane geometry and turn on this area light that is right behind it. If I set the retrace threshold value to 0 and render the scene, you notice we get these artifacts in form of light leaks down here. That's because right now those untrusty point cloud samples from this corner are being used in our final solution. If I increase it to 1 and render the scene again, the issue is less evident, but we still have some light leak left. Let's try 2 and render again. It's almost gone, but we still have a bit light leak left. Let's try 3 and render again. We can actually see the leaky samples in the point cloud calculation before the render starts, but during the final render, they will be ignored by the primary engine because we have used a higher retrace threshold value. And now at retrace threshold of 3, the light leak issue is completely gone. For now, let's set it to its default value of 1 and hide the plane and turn off the light. Now let's take a look at this point cloud mode up here. We have 4 modes: rebuild, don't save, rebuild, pre-pass only, rebuild, and load. Rebuild, don't save means that Redshift will compute a new Iridium's point cloud from scratch for each frame, but will not save it to disk, and the frame will be rendered after the point cloud computation is finished. So in this mode, when we start a final render, the Iridium's point cloud will be calculated but not saved, then the final render begins. Rebuild pre-pass only means Redshift will compute a new Iridium's point cloud from scratch for each frame and will save it to the user specified file down here. The final rendering pass will be skipped. So while in this mode, if I start a render, The point cloud will be calculated and saved on disk, but the final render won't start. You can change where you want to save that file right here. And when mode is set to rebuild, Redshift will compute a new Irradiance point cloud from scratch for each frame and will save it to the user specified file here. The frame will be rendered to completion as well after the computation of the Irradiance point cloud and saving it. So while in this mode, if we start a render, point cloud will be calculated and saved in this path here, then the final render starts. And when mode is set to load, we simply tell Redshift do not calculate point cloud from scratch before starting the final render. Just use the file that we have previously saved using rebuild or rebuild prepass only modes. So if I start the render right now, Redshift will start the final render immediately and uses the previously saved point cloud computation instead. We'll learn about these modes more when talking about global illumination consideration when rendering animations later on in this section. And finally, there is this frames to blend option here. It allows averaging the result of multiple Irradiance point cloud files, one for each frame together, in order to improve any flickering effects that might be present. That means if this value is bigger than 0 when rendering a frame in an animation, the point cloud calculation that are previously saved for adjacent frames will be blended together for a more accurate result. For example, if we are rendering frame number 5 in our animation and the frames to blend is set to 1, the point cloud files for 3 frames will be blended together. Frame number 5 itself, 1 frame before frame 5, and 1 frame after it. We'll learn how to use this value in practice when discussing global illumination considerations for rendering animation later on in this chapter of the course. For now, let's move on. Now let's see how we can use light cache in this scene to take a nice and smooth final render. The primary engine is brute force as always. Make sure secondary GI engine is Irradiance point cloud. Bounces is set to 4. Let's change the point cloud mode to rebuild, don't save. As it's a very simple scene lighting wise, the default value for screen radius, sample per pixel, and retrace threshold will be enough. Let's just go to the sampling tab and decrease our noise threshold to 0.004 and take a final render. And we get this nice clean render in only 11 seconds. Let's open up the second scene for this lesson, which is our complex interior shot, this classroom scene, to learn how to use Irradiance point cloud as a secondary GI engine in a more complex scene. I'm going to open up the render settings and go to the global illumination tab. Again, the primary engine will be brute force. The secondary engine will be Irradiance point cloud. As we are dealing with a more difficult lighting and direct lighting can't reach to a lot of surfaces in the scene, we can use lower screen radius like 8. Probably 16 would be enough as we are just rendering a simple HD resolution render, and maybe a higher samples per pixel like 32. I'm also going to increase my retrace threshold to something like 2 to avoid any possible artifacts and light leaks in the corners. Finally, let's go to the sampling tab and make sure the threshold value is around 0.003 to clean up some of the high frequency noise. Now let's take a final render. And here is our final render, which only took around 45 seconds. One thing I should have mentioned earlier is when running IPR in the render view, as it is intended for real-time feedback, brute force will be used as the primary and secondary engine, even if you have point cloud defined as your secondary engine in the render settings. So that's about Irradiance point cloud as a secondary GI engine. See you in the next video. In this lesson, we talk about Irradiance Cache GI engine. Before going through this lesson, I want you to know my opinion about Iridian's caching as a GI solution. I haven't used it in several years, just to be honest with you. And as our machines become more capable, using shortcuts that sacrifice accuracy for speed becomes unacceptable. And Iridian's cache is one of those shortcuts. It's a good solution if you have a very moderate computer. Beyond that, nobody uses it anymore. And personally, I haven't seen being used in production in a very long time. So that is why I won't be going through every single parameter of Iridian's cache, and I'll be just covering some of the fundamental concepts about it and some of its more important parameters. You can safely skip this video and move on to the next one, as I won't be using it in the rest of the course and you probably won't be using it in your projects. So let's get started. The key difference between Iridian's cache and brute force is the fact that in Iridian's cache, instead of computing GI for all the shaded points that are visible to the camera, GI will only be computed at some points and interpolated for others. Let's open up our render settings. Set Iridian's cache as your primary engine, and as you can see, there is no Iridian's cache in the secondary engine. That's because it only can be used as a primary engine. For now, we can disable secondary engine by setting bounces to 1 to focus on Iridian's cache. In the render view, load the render from the side view. The camera is roughly here in the scene. As it is a view-dependent method, the first rays are shot from the camera into the scene to determine the placement of the GI samples. Now remember, unlike brute force, we wouldn't have one sample at each shaded point. The samples will be created for only some points in the scene. So when one of these rays hits a point on a surface, a GI sample will be created. From these points, the hemispherical burst of GI rays will be traced into the scene to gather information. And the number of these rays is controlled by the rays parameter in the Iridian's cache settings. Obviously, more rays equals to a higher quality GI solution. Okay, now we have the GI solution for some of the points in the scene. What about the points that weren't lucky enough to get any GI samples? For those points, Redshift takes some of the already calculated samples from around that point and interpolates between them and averages them out to come to a solution for that point. And the same thing will happen for the other unsampled points in the scene. And like before, if we have a secondary GI engine enabled, when a GI ray hits a surface, the secondary engine tries to bounce that ray in the scene. One essential thing you need to know about Iridian's cache is that it's produced in several passes. What I mean by that is, let's say in the first pass, the samples are created all over the place randomly. In that first pass, Iridian's cache tries to assess the scene and see where are the details in the scene. In the next passes, in each pass, it tries to add more samples to more detailed and more complex parts of the scene, and this process happens before the final render begins. I'm gonna open up the AOV manager from the Redshift menu and add global illumination AOV. Take a render and see what we get without changing anything else. Iridian's cache, as mentioned, is created in several passes. Right now, based on our current Iridian's cache settings, we are using 4 passes to generate Iridian's cache. As this is a simple scene, that process is very fast. We can decrease or increase the number of these passes using these min-max rate values. In the first pass, it tries to get an idea of the scene, and in the following passes, it adds more and more samples to the detailed areas. And after those passes are calculated, we start to render the final image. This is our render, and as you can see, it took a few seconds, which is very quick, and we have a fairly clean render. And if I go to the GI pass, you can see it's clean, even though it might lack some details compared to the brute force render. In the Irradiance cache settings, you can use these presets to control a large number of Irradiance cache settings. So obviously, when you go from low preset to high preset, you're going to increase the overall quality of your Irradiance cache and also increase your render times or the time Redshift needs to calculate GI. We also have these 3 other parameters, including raise, adaptive amount, and adaptive error threshold, that won't be affected by the preset buttons, and we have to work on them manually. Each of these presets contain predefined settings for some of the Irradiance cache parameters, which are min and max rate, color, noise, and distance thresholds, and a few other things. Right now, we don't have any idea what these parameters are doing, so let's set the preset to custom so we can adjust these parameters as we wish. The first and the most important Irradiance cache parameters are min rate and max rate. Remember, we mentioned Irradiance cache is created in several passes, and each pass adds more samples to the more detailed areas. Not only we can control the number of those passes using min rate and max rate, but we can also control the resolution at which those GI passes are being calculated. Right now, min rate is set to -3 and max rate is set to 0. That means we have 4 passes: -3, -2, -1, and 0. If I change my min rate to -4, now we get 5 passes: -4, -3, -2, -1, and 0. And if, let's say, max rate is set to 1, now we'll be having 6 passes: -4, -3, -2, -1, 0, and 1. And with each pass, we'll add more samples to the detailed areas. Now let's set the min rate to -3 and max rate to 0. Min rate determines the resolution for the first GI pass, the one with the least amount of detail. If min rate is set to 0, this pass would have the same resolution of the final image. If set to 1, we are doubling the resolution of our final output to calculate Irradiance cache in that particular pass. And if set to -1, it would have half of the final image resolution, and so on. So when set to something like -3, we are using a very low resolution to calculate the first GI pass, and this pass would be good enough for large, flat, even areas. And as we go through the other passes, we increase the resolution twice each time and add more samples to the detailed areas. And max rate determines the resolution of the final GI pass. So clearly, if you use a min rate of, let's say, 0 and max rate of 3, you will also have 4 passes, but those 4 passes will have higher quality compared to, let's say, -3 and 0. They would take more time to calculate, and at 1, for example, we will have double the resolution of the final image. But the wise thing to do is to always make sure min rate has a negative value so we can calculate the less interesting and more flat, even areas very quickly. So the higher resolution passes would be used to calculate more complex areas. You normally don't have to use anything more than 1 as the max rate value, and maybe 2 in very extreme scenarios. Let's take 2 renders. For the first one, set the min and max rate to -7 and -4. Take a render and add it to the snapshots. And for the next render, set the min and max rate to -3 and 0. If we take a render, and save this one as well and compare the 2 renders, in the lower quality render, you can see tons of details are gone. Take a look at the contact shadows here, and if you compare it to our higher quality render, you can see the contact shadows are almost gone, and you can see that throughout the scene. You can also see some artifacts here and there if you pay close attention. For now, set it to -3 and 0, and let's use the medium preset. The last parameter I want to cover here is the raise value. Raise controls the number of primary GI rays, the red rays if you remember. So the higher this number, the higher the quality of our GI samples. Let's render our scene with different raise number and see what we get. Let's set it to 1 and take a render. As we can see, we have an extremely splotchy render. That's because each sample can send only 1 ray and the quality of the samples will be very low and therefore an inaccurate GI solve. Next, set it to 4 and take another render. And obviously the quality is a lot better compared to our previous render, but still very splotchy and unusable. And as we start increasing the number of rays and render, we get a higher quality GI solution each time. Let's set it to its default of 2000s. Normally 2000 will be enough for most cases. For more detailed, complex interior shots and more difficult lighting shots, you might need to use values like 4000 or even higher. Now that's enough for Irradiance Cache, as it's no longer used in modern workflows, and I have a gut feeling they might actually remove it completely in the future releases. I skipped the rest of the parameters here. Let's finish up the GI solution. We can use the medium preset for most cases, especially in simple scenes like what we have here, and get an acceptable result. For more demanding detailed scenes, you can opt in for the high preset. Rays at 2000s is more than enough. Let's set our bounces to 4. For the secondary engine, we will use point cloud. We can decrease the noise threshold to 0.005 to get a cleaner direct lighting pass, as when using Irradiance Cache and point cloud as our primary and secondary GI engines, you wouldn't get any high frequency noise in your final GI solution. Now let's take a render and see what we get. The render only took around 7 seconds, very fast, and we get this clean render. For this type of very simple scenes, Irradiance Cache can be useful, but for more complex setups or animations, using Irradiance Cache should not be considered. Now let's go to the second scene for this lesson. Let's open up the render settings and go to the GI tab. And change the primary engine to Irradiance Cache and secondary engine to point cloud. As it is a more complex scene, I'm gonna change the preset to high, which gives us a -3 and 1 as the mean and max rate. Increase rates to 4000 as it's a more complex scene, and that would increase the render time as well. And for animations, we need to do a lot of preparations when using Irradiance Cache, and that would increase both the render time and getting to render time, which if you think about it, we can simply opt in for the brute force, which has no settings, and get perfect result every time for stills and animations. That's why I no longer use Irradiance Cache. For the point cloud, let's set the screen radius to 8 and samples per pixel to 32. And increase retray threshold to 2, and finally decrease the global noise threshold to 0.003. We can also add our global illumination AOV. Now let's take a render to see what we get. Because we have used higher settings for the Irradiance Cache, the prepass takes longer before the final render starts. So here is our render, which took around 30 seconds. The result is acceptable with some minor flaws, especially if we take a look at more detailed areas of the scene. If I zoom in, we start to notice some of the issues, and it would be more visible in the global illumination pass. Some loss of detail and splotches around the shadow lines. Contact shadows are not that defined. So that's about Irradiance Cache. My advice to you is just use brute force instead, and you will get perfect render each and every time for stills or animations. God forbid if you use Irradiance Cache for any sort of animation. If you don't set it up perfectly, the render will be called Flicker Town. Irradiance Cache is basically like an old football player or soccer player. He's been here for a very long time. He was great at his time a decade ago, but there are better players now. We can keep him on the side for a bit longer as he's done a lot for the club in the past. Soon he has to leave. We'll never talk about Irradiance Cache in this course again. See you in the next video. In this lesson, we talk about global illumination considerations when rendering animations. This is the scene I have, and if I play through the timeline, we get this basic camera and object animation. Just a 100 frame sequence, but it will be more than enough to get my points across. So in the old days when computers were much slower compared to now, using Iridian's cache and point cloud as primary and secondary GI solutions was the only choice. In that case, we had to go through a lot of preparations before starting the render in order to avoid heavy flickering and artifacts in our renders. But as our machines are becoming faster, rendering animations with brute force as the primary and secondary engine, or brute force point cloud as primary and secondary, becomes a more viable choice for more people. Let's open up the render settings and let's go to the global illumination tab. The best solution for rendering animations or stills is using brute force as both the primary and secondary GI engine. Of course, if you can handle the longer render times. This will give you a bulletproof render, clear of any artifacts and flickering, no convoluted setups and preparations. The only thing you need to worry about is the high frequency noise level, which is controlled by the threshold value under the sampling tab. So when opting for brute force as both your primary and secondary engine, there is no GI setup involved. You just come to the sampling tab and try to play around with the threshold value until you find a good balance between speed and the final quality of the image, and then go for the final render. Let's actually do that and find a nice threshold value for this scene if we were to use brute force and brute force. For final renders, especially when using automatic sampling, I suggest starting from a threshold value of around 0.005 and working your way down to lower values if necessary, especially if you are not planning on using denoisers. Before starting the final render of your animation, it is wise to go through your timeline and render out a few individual frames just to make sure the render time is manageable across the animation. As I have a simple animation where the camera does not move a lot, I'm just gonna pick the last frame in the timeline and render a few tests, trying different threshold values before committing to the final render. In this case, let's try a few renders with noise thresholds set to 0.005, 0.004, 0.003, 0.002, and 0.001. Before that, let's make sure we are rendering at 1920 by 1080. Now let's take a look at the renders. The first one with noise threshold set to 0.005 took about 2.5 minutes to render. If we zoom in, we can clearly see some high frequency noise all over the place, and it will jump out more in a rendered sequence. So probably we need to lower the threshold value here. In the next render, threshold was set to 0.004, and this render took almost 3 minutes. If we zoom in, we can clearly see some improvements. The high frequency noise is less visible. It might be a bit hard to see the difference through this recording, but this could be a good starting point. In the next one, threshold was set to 0.003. This render took 3.5 minutes, and this one is probably the sweet spot for this render. The image is clean, the high frequency noise is barely visible, and the render time is still fairly quick. If I compare it to our first render, we can see some progress. In the next render, threshold was set to 0.002, and this is a much cleaner render. I can see this is the biggest improvement compared to our previous renders, but the render time is almost 5 minutes. And for the last render here, threshold was set to 0.001 with 8 minutes of render time, but it's a perfect render. If you can manage the render time, this will give you the best render. But compared to our sweet spot at noise threshold of 0.003, the render time has more than doubled. If I set this render as the A side or the left side, and the first render with threshold of 0.005 as the B side or the right side, you can do that by right-clicking on these saved images. You can probably see it even through this encoded recording. The difference is very clear, and we get a much better and cleaner render when using 0.001. In this case, I probably settle for 0.003 as my noise threshold value. Now, at this point, it's just a balancing act. When using brute force as your both primary and secondary GI engine, you just use the noise threshold value to balance between noise level and render time. You can also opt in for brute force point cloud setup as well, depending on your scene. This particular scene here might be a fairly good candidate for a brute force approach, because we do have a fair amount of direct lighting, but we still have some spots where we rely heavily on indirect lighting or global illumination. But it's not like a daytime interior setup where the light only comes through the windows and we have to rely on global illumination completely for the rest. In that case, the only viable solution for most people will be brute force point cloud. But even in that case, if you have access to a render farm, your own or an online one, brute force is still the preferable choice. Let's try brute force point cloud and see if it gives us any advantage in this particular scene or not. So I'm gonna change the secondary engine to point cloud, increase retrace threshold to 2 and sample per pixel to 32. And again, try a few renders with noise threshold values from 0.005 to 0.001. When the noise threshold is set to 0.005, the render took about 1 minute and 50 seconds. The same render with the brute force method took 2 minutes and 34 seconds, so 30-40% faster. And if we compare the two, we get a very similar result. They are almost identical, and if we look at the renders with brute force point cloud method and lower noise thresholds, they are again cleaner compared to higher noise threshold renders. That's what we expect. If we take a look at our render with threshold set to 0.003 in both brute force and brute force light cache methods, you notice they are very similar. I can see here that the full brute force solution is a bit more accurate, but the render time for the full brute force solution is 3 minutes and 40 seconds, while the same render with brute force point cloud is only 2 minutes and 15 seconds. So again, 40-45% faster, and that is significant. And the render with noise threshold of 0.002 took 3 minutes in comparison to the full brute force render, which took 5 minutes. And the render with the lowest threshold took 5 minutes, while the full brute force render took more than 8 minutes. So it's really up to you at the end. In this case, if we go for a brute force render with the noise threshold of 0.003, considering the length of the animation, which is 100 frames, and the fact that it will take around 4 minutes per frame on average, we are looking at a 6.5 hour render time. But if we go for the brute force point cloud method with the same noise threshold, considering each frame will take about 2 minutes and 30 seconds on average, the render time will be about 4.5 hours on this machine. You notice the difference is considerable, around 30% faster render time. If you don't care about that extra render time, which you probably do, go for the brute force approach and use the lowest possible noise threshold that you can manage and start your final render. Otherwise, choose brute force point cloud and lower the threshold as much as you can. Adjust your point cloud settings, save out your point cloud maps for the entire sequence, and then start your final render. In this case, I'm just going to use the brute force point cloud approach to also show you how to properly set up your point clouds map when rendering animation. First, let's set the noise threshold to 0.003. So let's go to the global illumination tab, increase the retrace threshold to around 2. If the scene is more complex, you can even go for 3. Samples per pixel to 32. Change the mode to rebuild pre-pass only. Define where you want to save out the Iridian's point cloud maps. Now, if we start a render, Redshift will compute Iridian's point cloud for each frame. stops the render without rendering the final image and saves out that point cloud file to this path that you have defined here. So let's go to the output tab. We want to render from frame 100 to 200. So change the frame range to the current preview range on the timeline, which gives us from frame 100 to 200. Now, if we start a final render to the picture viewer, you probably get this message that tells you haven't specified a file name and the image won't be saved. Do you want to continue without saving? Which we do, as we are trying to only save out the point cloud maps, which Redshift does it. So I'm going to press yes and wait a bit. Now Redshift will go through the entire sequence, calculates and saves a point cloud map for each frame without rendering the final image. For this render, this particular step will probably take 10-15 minutes for the entire sequence. It might take less or more depending on your scene. I'm gonna stop the render actually, as I have already done this before. Let me open up the folder where I have saved these point cloud maps. And here they are. Now we can point Redshift to this folder and tell it to use these point cloud files when rendering the animation without recalculating them for each frame. So let's get back to Redshift and change the Iridian's point cloud mode to load. Change the path to where you have saved the maps. And let's do that. I have saved these maps in this folder. And now we can use these frames to blend value, which, as we talked about it in the point cloud video, it allows averaging the result of multiple Iridian's point cloud files, one for each frame, together in order to improve any flickering effects that might be present. That means if this value is bigger than 0 when rendering a frame in an animation, the point cloud calculation that are previously saved for adjacent frames will be blended together for a more accurate result. 1 would be enough for now. As we are using ACES and trying to save out our render through Cinema 4D's native options, we need to go to the Globals tab. Under Color Management, change the View Transform to Raw and disable Compensate for View Transform. In the ACES lesson in the introduction section of the course, I told you why you need to apply these changes to your color management if you are using ACES and saving out through Cinema 4D's saving options. Now we are ready to start our final render. So let's go to the Save tab. Define where you want to save your render, name it properly, and click on the Save button. As we are rendering with ACES, let's change the format to OpenEXR, and to save some space, we can change the depth to 16-bit for now. We can also disable multipass rendering as we don't have any AOVs set up. So that's it. We can start the render. Now the render starts and we have to wait a few hours. Remember, the renders will look wrong in the picture viewer, but that's what they are supposed to look, as we will apply proper ACES conversions to them in Fusion or in another post-processing app. I'm just gonna stop the render as I have already done that. Let me just show you the folder where I have saved all the renders. Here they are. The entire sequence took about 4.5 hours on this machine. Now we can take a look at the final render. Let me quickly open up Fusion. And load the render in Fusion. I'm gonna change the frame rate to 25 frames per second to get a 4-second animation with our 100 frame. We can play through to see what we get. We just need to wait a bit so Fusion can load all the frames. Now, you notice the render looks wrong. We just need to tell Fusion this is an ACES CG render. We want you to show it to us in sRGB. So I'm going to add an OCIO color space node. And here we need to load the proper OCIO ACES config file. To download OpenColor.io configuration from GitHub, just Google OpenColor.io configs, and the first index should be what you need to get. Then simply click on the download button and extract the downloaded archive somewhere safe on your storage. In there, you will find different versions of ACES. It would be better to use the latest one. Let me use the config file in this OCIO config pass. Change the source space to ACES CG and output space to out sRGB. Now, if we view this node, we see our render exactly the way it looked in the render view. Let's play again and wait for all the frames to be loaded in the timeline. Let me also grab Fusion and put it on my other screen and then press 3 to load a full screen display for our render. So here is our render, very clean without any weird artifacts or splotches or flickering. The noise level is both acceptable and deliverable, so we are good. I just noticed we might have forgotten to apply materials to some objects, but that's okay. Let's quickly get back to Cinema and talk about denoising in Redshift. So let's open up the render settings and get back to the sampling tab and come down to the denoising section. The reason you use denoising is obviously to cut render time. You use higher threshold values, get faster renders, and denoising will give you a very clean render. So you get a fast render that is clean. This can work quite well for still renders, but if you want to apply denoising to an entire animation, you need to do denoising properly, because if you don't, you might lose a lot of detail, and more importantly, denoising can cause artifacts when applied to an entire sequence. At this point, unfortunately, Redshift lacks a proper post denoiser for animations. There are some workarounds. Normally, what you want to do is to not apply denoising to your final renders, but use a post-processing denoiser that uses different AOVs and apply denoising to your entire sequence after the rendering is finished for the entire sequence. Then you can use temporal denoising and use adjacent frames to have a near perfect denoising solution. Redshift has that to a certain level, but it does require a lot of manual setup and a lot of trials and errors, and you also need to render each frame twice to be able to apply a proper denoising to your final image. WTF. And to do that, Redshift doesn't even give you a simple GUI to manage that, and you have to set everything up through command line. I don't go through the process as they have to introduce a better solution like their competition have already done. It's a shame, really. For now, you can just apply denoising to your final render per frame and hope for a nice result. So I'm gonna enable denoising. Altus Dual is a very good denoiser. Unfortunately, it has to render the frame twice to get to that result. What we can do is to use higher threshold values to get faster renders per frame. So what happens is that you render your frame twice, but because you are using higher threshold values, the overall render still will be faster. Then you apply denoising, which takes a few seconds per frame. And now we will get a final render which took less time compared to when we used lower threshold values. But now because you have denoising applied, you get a cleaner render, even though you might lack some texture details and see some artifacts. Mostly lack of details because Altus Dual is actually quite good. So let's change our sampling threshold to 0.01 and render the scene in the render view. To see the render properly in the render view, let's go to the color management, change the view transform to ACES, and enable compensate for view transform. So here is our render. The frame will be rendered twice, so be patient. The render itself and the denoising process after it took only 1 minute and 53 seconds, which is 22 seconds faster compared to when we used 0.003 as our threshold without denoising. But if you take a look at the denoise render, it gives you a very clean result, absolutely no high frequency noise. On the downside, we have a softer image and we have missed some texture details. So for now, while we are waiting for a better way to do post-animation denoising solution, you can use this approach. So if you want to use denoising in your final render, you can do it this way for now. And now you can render the scene exactly like the previous render. The point cloud map is already set up. Define a file path to save your render and start the final render. I have already done that and the render took about 3 hours and 45 minutes. Let's go to Fusion and show you that render as well. I'm just gonna copy these two nodes and load the denoise render in this loader node and view it in the right view. Now let's press play and wait for Fusion to load the entire sequence. And here we have our denoise render, which is very clean, but lacks some texture detail. And as we haven't done it properly, as sequences must be denoised with a post-processing denoiser with temporal denoising, i.e. adjacent frames needs to be considered in denoising a frame. We might see some flickering and jittering if we pay close attention, but in this case, it's actually good and usable. We talk about denoising in detail later on in the rendering section of the course. So that's about global illumination and animation. See you in the next one.